Isao Takahata is one of the most respected directors of Japanese animation, best known for his work at Studio Ghibli. But in 1959, Isao was a graduate of French literature with no prior experience in animation, who somehow ended up as an assistant director at the newly formed Toei Doga, or as it's known in the West, Toei Animation. At the time, Toei was intending to become the Disney of the East, and by 1964 they were producing at least one film a year, with strict deadlines of 8 to 10 months for what was at the time a small group new to the industry. This harsh factory-like environment led the animators to strike, in which Isao's heavy involvement brought him to notoriety. He was working alongside the chief secretary of Toei Doga's labor union, a young animator named Hayao Miyazaki. Through the Toei negotiations, Yasao Otsuka, Isao's mentor, had recommended him for the directing position on the next film. By this point, Takahata was an up-and-coming employee at Toei, who had also impressed his peers with his work on the series Ken the Wolf Boy. This was Takahata's first chance to have directorial control on a featured animation. Furthermore, the budget was 100 million yen, which at the time was the highest budget Toei had ever given to a film. Most of the animators were from the younger generation, which wanted to try a more diplomatic model of working by letting other members contribute to the storyboarding process. This is where Miyazaki rose to prominence within the team, as he committed much to these meetings, becoming a key animator and a title they had to create for him, scene designer. The team wanted to make something different from what they had done before, something that wouldn't only appeal to kids. It would be darker and have less humour, however it'd still have a sense of adventure. Isao had found inspiration in a puppet play called Chikisane no Taiyo, a reinterpretation of an Ainu fable. The Ainu were an indigenous tribe in the northern islands of Japan which had its own culture. But Toei didn't want to set the film in Japan, as it was taboo to do so at the time, and thought to hinder international appeal. How times have changed. The setting was now Iron Age Scandinavia. While they removed the location, you can see concepts of Ainu culture within the story and design. This film eventually became known as Horus, Prince of the Sun. While Horus was made before Ghibli, you can start to see the types of themes they would explore in their later output, especially within Miyazaki's work: a coming-of-age story, environmentalism, and community. Community being one of the most important within the themes of the film, and its own development. By the 1960s, the economy of Japan was growing at a rapid rate. There was a lot of talk of the trend of individualism. At the time, the younger generation were rebelling against the status quo, with examples in California and the Paris student riots of 1968. This mindset was at the heart of the new generation of Toei Doga, who were bringing socialist ideas to their approach. Even though they were willing to fight for their creative intent, it was not enough to win every creative battle with Toei. Isao had to fight both tooth and nail against the higher-ups at Toei, who still wanted something safe and conventional. Not to mention, Isao's group were over-ambitious and not quite used to the newer methods of working. What was supposed to be completed within 10 months took over 2.5 years and went completely over budget. Even when they cut half an hour of content from the proposed runtime, they still were not able to finish every scene, nor was the animation director able to check every frame for errors. They were overusing cells, and Takahata's hope in the project was fading day by day. To add insult to injury, Toei was not happy with the outcome, only giving the film a 10-day limited release in theaters. The project was deemed a financial flop, and Isao was then demoted, never to direct at Toei again. Toei even changed the name of the film in Europe to the Little Norse Prince, to tie it in with a famous comic, having no faith in its own brand. Despite all the production problems, Prince of the Sun had unparalleled animation in contrast to what had came before. Not to say Toei Doga had no merit. Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon won the Noboru Ofuji Award for Excellence in Animation, but we can talk about that film another day. Prince was going toe-to-toe with Disney. In one corner of the world, there now exists a commercial animation that has surpassed Disney and has started to make rapid advances. American critic Mark Schilling, after seeing Horus and The Jungle Book. There's a raw sense of kinesthetics in the fights that comes from the lack of polish, which gives the film its own style. It's visceral and fluent in its animation, akin to Golden Age Disney cartoons. In particular, there's a lot of attention given to movement within the characters, almost rotoscoped in how smooth it can flow. This film is also one of the first in Japan to start using parallax scrolling, which gives it, as well as its directing, a sense of epic adventure that runs through the film. At times it can be borderline experimental in its visual flair, almost avant-garde. And of course there were lots of minor inconsistencies throughout the film. 2 large-scale battles were never finished, and the only thing left are key frames that they zoom into, which comes off as awkward and hard to follow. Even with those inconsistencies, there are some standout moments, including a fight with a giant pike, which would inspire future Ghibli set pieces. The scene itself is a landmark within action animation, one of the highlights of the film, which slowly builds on top of the drama from the events beforehand, creating tension throughout until it erupts, bursting into an intense display of boy versus beast. The design of the pike and how it moves is noteworthy. It seems like the animators wanted to convince as much as possible that it was a fluent creature, adding more detail than usually seen in the film, giving it this uncanny horror aspect. The influence of these simple character designs came from Yusuji Mori and Yasuo Otsuka, who would go on to help define the look of Ghibli's future animations. Of course, not all the designs in this film are as successful as others, some being quite bad or awkward, and others good, and even some that are amazing. In particular, Hilda has a great depth of expression within her face, which really adds to her character and complements her clean design. Many writers have mentioned how complex the characters are in Horus, but this is a bit of a misnomer. Most of the characters are tropes with little story or motive to see. Holds does have this early shonen protagonist attitude, which is at least historically notable, although as a character he's simply beholden to the events unfolding, but that also makes him easy to root for. What we do have here is one complex character, for the time. Hilda is a more morally grey character than we had seen before at Disney. Her arc is the most involving throughout the film, dealing with confliction and ambiguous motives. The film does not shy away from her doing terrible things, including convincing the tribe that Horus himself is a demon through paranoia and illusions. While the film paints her as flawed, she is still a sympathetic character on the whole. What complements this character is the use of song and music. Hilda's theme is melodic, but also has an undercurrent of melancholy. The main theme uses a child's choir, which is reminiscent of a time with shows like Astro Boy or the film Gamera. But this style brings a feeling of youth and adventure that complements the animation's goal. Michio Mamiya did the composing on Horus and would go on to work with Aizo again in Grave of the Fireflies, to much acclaim. In contrast to the work of Disney, the soundtrack is minimal and uses stings and striking moments. It knows when not to use the music, unlike other children's entertainment. Aizo's style and direction is the focus here, of the emotions within each scene. That's the power of Aizo, how he can bring the emotional core of a story to his audience no matter how simple. You want to root for these characters, to overcome obstacles, like the animators wanted to overcome this production. Because of its newer style, Horus has been called the first adult anime film. But this is not true. That would go to Mushi Productions' 1969's 1001 Nights, which has its own story to tell another day. What we do have here is a family film with subtext and conflicting characters that could be the first modern anime, the new wave. It's immediate, always moving with well-crafted action scenes and a grand scale. The message of coming together to be greater than the sum of your parts seems reflective of the animator's struggle. It wouldn't have existed if not for the ability of the team, including the work of everyone, no matter how small. There's a saying about hardships and how they bring those who experience them together. Horus may have been the first collaboration between Hayao and Aizawa, but it would form a bond that would last over 50 years, setting up their own studio, where this group of animators would follow to define a generation. Even if Asao never directed at Toei again, he moved on to do so much more, while Toei as a company has ended up finding every way to cut corners on production and animation. They've lost all sight of being the Disney-like company they were in the past, now relying on long-form popular shows that they can produce forever, and nostalgia baiting to get their money. While Horus doesn't live up to the heights of later Ghibli milestones, it shouldn't have to. It's a humble film made with passionate young people, still trying to find their footing. Its blood runs through the industry now, and should be judged by its own merits. It has idealistic goals to compete with Disney, and in the long run, the studio it built outlasted even Disney's own traditional department. And with the ex-Ghibli animators forming to become Studio Ponic, we could see the whole story repeat all over again. In the US, the Blu-ray release of Prince of the Sun has a lot of behind-the-scenes content that goes into more detail than I do here. In the UK, there is a DVD release, but it's not as complete. Hopefully, if there is demand, we can get our own complete edition and give more exposure to this piece of animation history.